In 2004, a government biologist stood at the edge of a marsh in southern Ontario and watched something he couldn't explain. The water was different. The vegetation along the bank had changed, and it wasn't gradual. It had shifted fast in less than a decade. He pulled out his notes from 10 years earlier. The numbers didn't match. Something had rewritten this ecosystem, and everyone already knew what it was. 300 Canada geese, imported from the United States, released into wetlands that had been quiet for decades. The plan was simple: restore a depleted population, give the birds back to a landscape that had lost them. What actually happened had nothing to do with the plan. Within years, the geese weren't just filling the gap. They were tearing through it. Shorelines that had held for generations began to collapse. Marshes that supported dozens of species started going silent. And then, something stranger. In regions where the geese had spread the furthest, certain plant species were appearing in places they had never been recorded before, not disappearing, arriving. Conservation biologists started asking a question nobody had thought to ask when they signed the release permits. Had they just repaired an ecosystem, or had they rebuilt something that no longer fit the world it was returning to? The answer would take 2 decades to find, and when it came, it didn't settle the debate. It started a new one. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand what was supposed to go right. Southern Ontario, late 1990s. The Canada goose population in certain wetland regions had collapsed. Decades of habitat loss, hunting pressure, and urban sprawl had pushed local breeding populations to near zero in areas where they had once been common. Wildlife managers looked at the empty marshes and made a decision: bring them back. The birds were sourced from established populations in the northeastern United States, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland. Healthy flocks, strong breeders, genetically sound. Around 300 birds were transported north across the border in the early 2000s and released into a network of wetlands, conservation areas, and protected shorelines across southern Ontario. The rationale was solid. Canada geese are native. The habitat existed. The food sources were there. The logic was clean. What the managers were working from was a restoration model. The idea that you return a species to a landscape, the system rebalances, and nature does the rest. It had worked before. It had worked spectacularly with wild turkeys 20 years earlier. There was no obvious reason to think this would be different. The first season, the birds settled well. The second season, they bred. By the third season, wildlife officers in the field were sending back reports that didn't quite fit the projections. The population wasn't stabilizing, it was accelerating. And the marshes those birds were moving through, the same marshes managers had worked for years to restore, were starting to look different. Not healthier, different. The field reports described something specific, not general overpopulation, not crowding, grazing pressure. Canada geese are grassers. They feed on grasses, sedges, aquatic vegetation, the same plant communities that line the edges of every wetland in southern Ontario. A small flock grazes lightly. The marsh recovers. A large flock grazes constantly, and a resident population, birds that no longer migrate, that stay year-round on the same patch of shoreline, grazes the same ground down to bare mud. That was the detail nobody had fully weighted. The geese imported from the American Northeast came from populations that had already made a behavioral shift. They weren't fully migratory anymore. Decades of mild winters, manicured parks, and reliable food sources near human settlements had produced birds that didn't leave. Ontario managers had imported resident geese into a wetland system built for seasonal visitors. The difference mattered enormously. A seasonal flock strips vegetation in autumn, then disappears. The marsh regrows by spring. A resident flock strips the same vegetation and is still there in spring, still there in summer, still grazing the regrowth before it can establish. By 2006, researchers monitoring shoreline transects at several southern Ontario conservation areas began documenting something that hadn't appeared in their baseline surveys. Bare zones, stretches of formerly vegetated bank, cattail margins, sedge meadows, native grass communities reduced to exposed soil. In some areas, the bare zones extended 15-20 meters back from the water's edge. The marsh wasn't degrading slowly. In places, it was being unmade, and the animals that depended on that fringe vegetation, the species the restoration was supposed to protect, were starting to move out. Beneath the bare zones, the soil itself had changed. This was the finding that stopped researchers mid-sentence when they reviewed the data. A healthy wetland shoreline holds its bank through root systems, dense, interlocking networks of sedge and grass roots bind the soil, absorb wave energy, filter runoff before it reaches open water, strip that vegetation, graze it down to bare mud season after season, and the root network dies. The bank becomes loose material sitting at the water's edge, and loose material at a water's edge does one thing: it enters the water. At 3 monitored sites along Lake Ontario's northern shoreline, sediment loading in the nearshore zone had measurably increased in the years following the goose population surge. The water was cloudier, submerged aquatic vegetation, the underwater plant beds that juvenile fish depend on for shelter, was declining in the same areas where shoreline erosion had accelerated. The geese hadn't just changed what the marsh looked like above the waterline. They had changed what was happening below it. Ecologists call this a trophic cascade, when the removal or addition of one element in an ecosystem triggers effects that move through the entire system, level by level, in ways nobody anticipated at the start. The managers who released 300 geese to restore a wetland had instead introduced the first pressure in a cascade that was now running downward through the food web. Fewer aquatic plants, less fish habitat, declining invertebrate populations in the disturbed sediment zones. And then one research team found something in the bird survey data that nobody had predicted. Certain waterfowl species the restoration was originally designed to support, were nesting in lower numbers at the most heavily grazed sites. The geese had come back, but they had brought silence with them. The problem wasn't the geese, not exactly. The problem was that the geese were native. That single fact made every management option politically and legally complicated in ways that invasive species management never is. You can cull a carp, you can trap a nutria, you can remove an animal that doesn't belong. But a Canada goose is exactly where it's supposed to be. It's protected under the Migratory Birds Convention Act, a bilateral treaty between Canada and the United States dating back to 1916. Touching the population in any meaningful way required federal authorization, intergovernmental coordination, and public justification. And the public, it turned out, had opinions. When Ontario wildlife managers first floated the idea of population control measures in the mid-2000s, egg oiling, habitat modification, targeted culling in the most degraded sites. The response was immediate. Petitions, letters, local news coverage framing the proposal as the government killing the birds it had just spent money bringing back. The optics were brutal. A conservation program celebrated for restoring wildlife was now being asked to reduce the wildlife it had restored. To the public, that looked like failure. To the ecologists writing the damage assessments, inaction looked worse. Meanwhile, the cascade was continuing. A long-term vegetation monitoring study at a conservation area east of Hamilton documented something in its 2009 survey that sharpened the urgency considerably. An invasive plant species, common reed, Phragmites australis, had begun colonizing the bare zones the geese had created. The stripped shorelines that the geese had opened up weren't recovering with native vegetation. They were being filled by one of the most aggressive wetland invaders in North America. The geese hadn't just damaged the marsh, they had unlocked it. The authorization came through in 2010, a coordinated management program, federal permits secured, egg oiling at the highest density nesting sites, targeted hazing to break resident flock patterns, strategic fencing, and replanting along the most degraded shoreline zones. It was not fast, it was not clean, and it was not cheap. But within 3 years, something in the data shifted. The bare zones at the managed sites began contracting. Native sedge and grass communities, planted deliberately along the restored banks, were establishing root systems, holding soil, rebuilding the fringe that had disappeared. And in the nearshore water, at 2 of the monitored sites, submerged aquatic vegetation began recovering, slowly, measurably, but recovering. By 2015, waterfowl nesting surveys at the most intensively managed conservation areas recorded species that hadn't bred there in nearly a decade. The marsh was coming back. But here is the detail that reframed everything. At sites where management had reduced grazing pressure and native vegetation had recovered, researchers began documenting seed dispersal patterns they hadn't expected. The geese, moving between restored zones and adjacent wetlands, were carrying seeds in their feathers and digestive tracts. Native wetland plant species were appearing at distances from their source populations that passive dispersal couldn't explain. The birds that had stripped the shorelines were now under managed conditions, seeding them. The same animal, the same behavior, a completely different outcome, depending entirely on density and context. That is what shocked the conservationists, not the damage. They had seen ecological damage before. What shocked them was the realization that the line between restoration and destruction wasn't the species, it was the number. 300 birds, imported with good intentions, had revealed something fundamental about how ecosystems actually work. They don't need the right animal, they need the right balance. If that idea stayed with you, subscribe. There are more stories like this one, where the science arrives long after the decision, and the answers change everything.